More than 100,000 Americans have died from the COVID-19 pandemic, the vast majority of them African Americans. But studies also show that this group, especially black men and boys, face the highest risk of being killed by police, 3 times higher than whites. Black Lives Matter! As cities nationwide boil over in protest over these twin epidemics, one expert says solutions lie not only with systemic reform, but with individual families. She's Margaret Hagerman, assistant professor of sociology at Mississippi State University and the author of White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. She spent 2 years embedded with white families in a Midwestern town, looking into the relationship between white privilege and racism, even in families that view themselves as progressive. Maggie Hagerman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was after grad school that you embedded yourself in an all-white community somewhere in the Midwest that remains anonymous, understandably. How did you present yourself? I mean, did you say, I'm here to study why you're a racist?
No, I did not approach participants with that. When I would, approach families, I would present this project as one that is exploring how parents prepare their children to participate in a diverse democracy. That was the language that I used. It was interesting because many of the white families that I invited to participate would often refer me to their friends of color. So like their black friend, their black neighbor, their Latino coworker. And I thought that was interesting that they believed, even before I started collecting data, that their children would not have anything to say about race, but that the black and brown children in their community would.
But what was some of the most surprising things and maybe some of the most important things that you learned during this 3 years, right?
So one of the great things about being an ethnographer and embedding myself in this community is that I was able to really document all of the different ways that children in my research learned about race. And so that included things their parents said. But what I found even more important was what their parents did. So the choices that their parents made about where to live or what school to send their children to or which extracurricular activities to enroll their kids in, where to travel, what kinds of media they consumed. All of these choices had really significant impacts on how children were interpreting their social environment. And so certainly for the kids that were living in that suburban community, they never came into contact with a person of color ever. Even their knowledge about racial difference or about, race in America came from things like TV shows and movies, which was interesting. And so I absolutely think that parents are shaping this process.
Now, you spoke about some of the more integrated communities, but in those predominantly white communities, in the schools, were they teaching African American history?
They were not receiving as critical of an education on the history of racism in America or African American history, certainly. And this was apparent based on the things that they said. One of the quotes in the very beginning of the book is from a child who tells me that since Martin Luther King and Eleanor Roosevelt and how she went on the bus and she was African American and sat on the white part after the 1920s and all that, things changed. And so I thought that was a really compelling quote because it demonstrates, just her lack of knowledge. And then her mother was sitting there when she said it and she was like, yeah, tell her, tell her what you know. So I thought that was interesting also.
This COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed a lot of information that people may not have been aware of. And that is that at the moment, the majority of people who are getting infected by the virus and who are dying are people of color, primarily Black people. Do you think that the attention that's been paid to that is going to make people look at African Americans and people of color differently?
On the one hand, perhaps yes, perhaps people will see that these numbers and just the tremendous trauma that the Black community in particular is facing in this moment. And perhaps that will make them take racial health disparities more seriously. On the other hand, I think that there's evidence that people have known about racial health disparities for a very long time. Linda Villarosa had an article in the New York Times Magazine, and in that she reminds us that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, the social conditions that lead to racial health inequality in 1899. And so this isn't something new.
So, based on your research, though, and your interaction with people who obviously became very comfortable with you in your presence, do you have any solutions that you can offer for people to deal with racism in a more positive way?
Well, I think that one of the patterns that I see is a lot of white parents believe that simply talking to their kids about racism will somehow ensure that their child will not reproduce racial inequality in their own life. And I always see these articles that come out. I've seen a lot recently that have come out in light of George Floyd, for example, where parents are being called to talk to their kids. And what my research shows is that talk is only part of the answer. And in fact, I think that parents, especially those like the ones in my study who are white and affluent and have a number of different kinds of privileges, when those parents use those privileges to give their own child advantages, that ultimately reproduces forms of inequality that are, part of the problem too.
But how do you change that? Because you can't tell people stop making money or stop being, well off. So how do you do that?
Every parent that I've spoken to has told me that they want their kid to be happy. And I think that trying to get your child an upper hand and an advantage at every turn and using the symbolic capital of whiteness as well as your economic privilege to do that is ultimately not going to lead to the kind of future that is good for all children or all people that live in this society. And I think that the most important thing that white parents can do is embrace the idea that all children are worthy of their consideration and that we should care about our community. We should think about the collective good. We should focus on how we can help everyone rather than just focusing on our own child.
And finally, let me ask you this. How important is it for people who are in leadership positions to say the right things about race? And does that really matter?
Yes, I absolutely think that it matters. It's important that people who are in leadership positions and in positions of authority take the realities of racism, the legacy of racism, the data and the facts that we have about racism seriously, and include those in not only what they say, but also what they do in terms of their policies and how they move forward as a leader.
Well, Maggie Hagerman, thank you so much for joining us. I know that this is going to be very instructive to a lot of people.
Thank you so much for having me.